My wife secretly installed an app at midnight to access my bank details. She used this information to take 400K and went on a trip. When she returned, she mocked me, saying, "Thanks to your mobile, I really enjoyed spending your 400K." I couldn't hold back my laughter because the bank data she accessed was actually, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I always thought I knew Margaret. 22 years of marriage teaches you a person's habits, their rhythms, the way they breathe when they sleep. I knew she took her coffee with 2 sugars, that she hummed old Beatles songs while doing laundry, that she always checked her phone 3 times before bed. What I didn't know was that on that Tuesday night in March, while I pretended to sleep beside her, she was installing software that would change everything between us forever. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of our heating system. Our bedroom in Westfield felt smaller somehow that night, the heavy mahogany furniture casting long shadows in the dim light from Margaret's phone screen. I lay on my side, eyes barely cracked open, watching her fingers move across my Samsung Galaxy with the kind of precision that comes from practice. She thought I was deep asleep after my usual 12-hour day at the office, but something had woken me. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the subtle shift in her breathing that told me she was being careful, deliberate. She held my phone at an angle that kept the light from hitting my face, her movements slow and methodical. I watched her navigate through screens I couldn't quite see, typing occasionally, pausing to read something. The whole process took maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. When she finally placed my phone back on the nightstand, exactly where I always left it, she settled back into bed with a soft exhale. Within minutes, her breathing had returned to its normal sleeping rhythm. I stared at the ceiling for the rest of the night, my mind racing. Margaret had never shown interest in technology. She barely knew how to update her own apps, yet she had just performed what looked like a complex installation on my device. The woman who claimed she couldn't figure out our smart TV remote had just demonstrated skills I didn't know she possessed. The next morning unfolded like any other Wednesday. Margaret made her usual breakfast of scrambled eggs and wheat toast, humming Yesterday while she worked. She kissed my cheek as I left for my train to Manhattan, told me to have a good day at the office, reminded me we were having dinner with her sister on Friday. Everything normal, everything the same as it had been for over 2 decades. Except now I knew she was hiding something significant. At my office overlooking Central Park, I couldn't concentrate on the quarterly reports spread across my desk. The numbers blurred together. As I replayed the previous night's scene, I picked up my phone dozens of times, studying the home screen, the apps, looking for anything that seemed different or out of place. Everything appeared exactly as I had left it, which somehow made it worse. During my lunch break, I walked to the small electronics store on 42nd Street that I had visited once before when my laptop crashed. The young technician, barely out of college with thick-rimmed glasses and nervous energy, listened as I explained my situation as vaguely as possible. My wife might have installed something on my phone while I was sleeping, I told him, feeling foolish even as the words left my mouth. Is there a way to check without her knowing? He nodded knowingly, as if this wasn't the first time someone had asked this question. Happens more than you'd think. Let me take a look. Within 20 minutes, he had found it. Hidden deep in my phone's system, disguised as a routine security update, was software designed to monitor and record everything. Banking apps, password entries, text messages, call logs, even my location. The sophistication of it surprised both of us. "This isn't amateur hour," the technician said, scrolling through lines of code. "This is professional-grade surveillance software. Whoever installed this knew exactly what they were doing. It's designed to capture financial information specifically. See here? It logs into your banking apps, records your keystrokes when you enter passwords, even takes screenshots of your account balances." My chest tightened. Margaret wasn't just snooping through my text messages out of curiosity or jealousy. This was calculated, purposeful theft. The woman I had shared a bed with for 22 years, who had cried in my arms when her father passed away, who had held my hand through my own mother's funeral, was planning to steal from me. Can you remove it without leaving any trace that it was discovered? I asked. The technician shook his head. If I remove it, the software sends an alert to whoever's monitoring. They'll know it was discovered. But I can install something that feeds it false information while keeping the real data protected. Kind of like creating a decoy. Do it, I said without hesitation. The ride home to Westfield that evening felt longer than usual. I sat in my usual window seat on the train, watching familiar suburbs blur past, trying to process what I had learned. The Margaret I thought I knew would never be capable of this level of deception. She was organized, yes, but not cunning. She was particular about money, but not greedy. Or so I had believed. When I walked through our front door, she was in the kitchen preparing dinner, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, one of my favorites. She looked up with the same smile she had given me that morning, the same smile she had given me for 22 years. "How was your day?" she asked, stirring the gravy with a wooden spoon. "Fine," replied, watching her face carefully. "Same as always." She nodded, returning her attention to the stove. "I was thinking we might take a vacation soon. Somewhere warm. We haven't been anywhere nice in years." The timing of her suggestion hit me like ice water. A vacation. Somewhere expensive, no doubt, funded by money she planned to steal from me. I managed to keep my voice level. "That sounds nice. Did you have somewhere specific in mind?" "Maybe Europe. Paris, Rome, Barcelona. We could do a whole tour." She turned to face me, and for just a moment I thought I saw something different in her eyes. Not the warmth I was used to, but something calculating. "We could afford it now, couldn't we? I mean, you've been working so hard, saving so much." "We'll see," I said, forcing a smile. That night I lay awake again, while Margaret slept peacefully beside me. The woman I had built a life with, bought a house with, shared dreams with, was systematically planning to betray me. The software on my phone was already working, recording every time I checked my bank balance, logging every password I entered. She was patient, methodical, probably waiting for the right moment to strike. But what Margaret didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the bank account she was now monitoring so carefully wasn't my only account. It wasn't even my primary account. The account that would soon show exactly what she expected to see, the account she would eventually drain of $400,000, was something else entirely. As I listened to her gentle breathing beside me, I realized that after 22 years of marriage, I was finally seeing my wife clearly for the first time, and she had no idea what she was really looking at when she stared at that phone screen. 3 weeks after discovering the app, I watched Margaret transform into someone I didn't recognize. The change wasn't sudden or dramatic. Instead, it was like watching a mask slowly slip away, revealing something cold underneath. She started staying up later, claiming she was reading, but I could see the glow of her phone screen reflected in the bedroom mirror. She began asking casual questions about my work schedule, when I would be traveling, whether I had any big meetings coming up. Questions that seemed innocent enough but felt like reconnaissance. The morning she made her move, Margaret was unusually affectionate. She made my favorite breakfast, pancakes with real maple syrup, something she hadn't done in months. She kissed me longer than usual when I left for work, told me she loved me with an intensity that should have felt wonderful but instead made my skin crawl. I knew she was saying goodbye to the husband she thought she was about to destroy. I was in my office when the first notification came through. The decoy software the technician had installed was working perfectly, feeding Margaret's spy app exactly what I wanted her to see while protecting my real accounts. My phone buzzed with an alert that $400,000 had been transferred from what she believed was my primary savings account to an account I didn't recognize. Then another transfer, smaller amounts going to different accounts, spreading the money around in a pattern that suggested someone trying to hide their tracks. By noon, my phone showed dozens of transactions. Margaret was working fast, efficiently, moving the money through multiple accounts before consolidating it somewhere I couldn't trace. The sophistication of her operation was breathtaking. This wasn't impulsive theft. This was a carefully planned financial crime that she had probably been preparing for months. At 2:30 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. A photo of a first-class airline boarding pass to Paris, followed by another photo of champagne being served in what looked like an expensive airport lounge. The message that accompanied the photos was brief. "Thanks to your mobile, I'm really enjoying spending your $400,000. I stared at the screen for several minutes, feeling something cold settle in my chest. It wasn't just the theft. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the cruelty of that message, the satisfaction she was clearly feeling in what she believed was my destruction. The woman I had loved for 22 years was taking pleasure in my pain. More photos followed throughout the day, Margaret checking into a 5-star hotel in Paris, the room service menu with items circled in red ink, showing me exactly how much she was spending. A selfie of her wearing jewelry I didn't recognize, expensive pieces that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Each photo came with a message designed to twist the knife deeper. "The suite is $1,200 a night, worth every penny of your money. This necklace was $15,000. Thank you for being such a generous husband. Dinner at Michelin-starred restaurant tonight. The wine alone costs more than your monthly train pass." I sat in my office, watching my wife document her betrayal in real time, and I realized that the Margaret I thought I knew had never really existed. The woman sending me these messages wasn't just stealing from me. She was savoring it. She wanted me to suffer, to feel helpless, to understand that she had outsmarted me completely. But the photos revealed something else, something Margaret probably didn't realize she was showing me. In several of the images, I could see the reflection of another person in windows, mirrors, the polished surface of wine glasses. A man, tall, with dark hair, someone I didn't recognize. Margaret wasn't traveling alone. She had brought her accomplice, probably her lover, along for the celebration. The realization hit me with unexpected force. This wasn't just about money. Margaret had been planning to leave me, had probably been having an affair for months or even years, and had decided to fund her new life with my savings. The theft was just the final step in a much larger betrayal. As the photos continued to arrive, I found myself studying them with a detachment that surprised me. Margaret posing with expensive shopping bags outside boutiques I couldn't pronounce, the two of them toasting with wine that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Her companion's face becoming clearer in each photo, a man maybe 10 years younger than me with the kind of easy smile that probably came naturally to someone who had never worked a real day in his life. "Having the most amazing time," read one message. "Amazing what a little planning can accomplish. You were always too trusting, Henry. Too focused on work to notice what was happening right under your nose." The messages kept coming for 3 days. Margaret seemed determined to document every expensive meal, every luxury purchase, every moment of what she clearly saw as her victory over the husband she had fooled for so long. She wanted me to feel stupid, naive, defeated. She wanted me to understand that while I had been working 60-hour weeks to build our future, she had been systematically planning to steal it. On Thursday evening, she sent a video. I almost didn't watch it, but something made me press play. Margaret was sitting on a balcony overlooking the Eiffel Tower, wine glass in hand, laughing with the same man who had appeared in the earlier photos. The camera was obviously being held by someone else, maybe a server at whatever expensive restaurant they were patronizing. "This is for my husband, Henry," Margaret said to the camera, her voice carrying a mocking tone I had never heard before. "The man who worked so hard to make all this possible. Henry, darling, if you're watching this, I want you to know that every penny of your $400,000 has been absolutely worth it. You always said I should travel more, see the world. Well, thanks to your generosity, I finally can." She raised her wine glass in a toast. "To Henry, the most generous ex-husband a girl could ask for." Ex-husband. She had already decided we were finished, had probably filed divorce papers before she even left the country. I sat in my empty house in Westfield, surrounded by 22 years of shared memories, and realized that my marriage had been over long before I discovered the app on my phone. But as I watched Margaret celebrate what she thought was my destruction, I found myself smiling for the first time in days. She had played her hand perfectly, executed her plan flawlessly, and documented every step of her crime with photographic evidence. She had just given me everything I would need for what came next. The only thing Margaret didn't know, the one detail that would have stopped her from sending even a single photo, was that the $400,000 she had stolen so efficiently wasn't really mine at all. Margaret returned from Paris on a Wednesday afternoon, exactly 1 week after she had drained what she thought was my life savings. I knew her flight details because she had sent me her itinerary along with a final mocking message. Time to come home and deal with the mess I left behind. Hope you've had time to think about what you've lost. I picked her up at Newark Airport, not out of kindness, but because I wanted to see her face when she realized the game wasn't over. She emerged from customs, looking radiant, tanned, wearing clothes I didn't recognize. Expensive clothes, $400,000 clothes. Her companion wasn't with her, which told me he had probably been smart enough to take a different flight, maybe even return to whatever rock he had crawled out from under. "Hello, Henry," she said as she slid into the passenger seat of my car. Her voice carried a satisfaction that made my stomach turn. "Miss me?" "Every day," I replied, pulling away from the curb. During the 40-minute drive back to Westfield, Margaret talked about her trip with the casual enthusiasm of someone describing a weekend getaway, rather than the funded-by-theft vacation it had actually been. She mentioned restaurants I couldn't afford, hotels that cost more per night than most people's monthly rent, shopping experiences that had probably single-handedly supported several European boutiques. "I feel like a new person," she said, watching the familiar suburbs pass by her window. "Sometimes you need to step away from your old life to realize what you really want." "And what do you want?" I asked, genuinely curious about her answer. She turned to look at me with eyes that held no warmth, no trace of the woman I had married 22 years ago. "I want my freedom, Henry. I want to stop pretending that this marriage has been anything more than a financial arrangement for the past 5 years." The honesty was refreshing, in a twisted way. After months of surveillance software and secret planning, she was finally being direct about her intentions. "When did you decide this?" "Probably around the time you started working 70-hour weeks and stopped noticing that I existed except as someone to make your dinner and wash your clothes." Her voice carried a bitterness that suggested this conversation had been rehearsed, probably practiced with her traveling companion during their European celebration. We pulled into our driveway, past the perfectly manicured lawn that I had spent countless weekends maintaining, up to the house that represented 22 years of shared mortgage payments and mutual investment. Margaret gathered her designer luggage from the trunk without waiting for my help, a woman who no longer needed assistance from the husband she had financially destroyed. Inside, she moved through our home with a different energy, like someone surveying property she no longer intended to share. She went straight to the kitchen and poured herself a glass of wine, the same expensive bottle she had been photographing in her Paris hotel room. "I suppose we need to discuss practical matters," she said, settling at our kitchen table with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. "Divorce proceedings, division of assets, that sort of thing." I sat across from her, marveling at her composure. "What assets would those be?" She laughed, a sound without humor. "Well, obviously the house will need to be sold. With your savings account empty, you can't afford the mortgage payments alone, but don't worry, Henry. I'm not completely heartless. I'll make sure you get enough from the sale to find a nice little apartment somewhere." "That's very generous of you." "I thought so." She took a sip of her wine, studying me over the rim of the glass. "You're taking this better than I expected. I thought there would be more tears, more begging. More of that pathetic neediness you've shown the past few years every time I seem distant." I nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "I suppose I should thank you." "Thank me." For the first time since her return, Margaret looked genuinely surprised. "For showing me who you really are. For helping me understand that the woman I thought I was married to never actually existed." I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where I had left a folder I had been carrying for the past week. "But mostly I should thank you for documenting your theft so thoroughly." Margaret's expression shifted, just slightly, like someone who had heard an unexpected sound and wasn't sure if it was important. My theft? $400,000, Margaret, transferred from my account while I was at work last Wednesday, followed by 7 days of photographs showing exactly how you spent it. I opened the folder and spread the printed copies of her photos across the kitchen table. These will make excellent evidence in court. She stared at the photos, then back at me, her confidence beginning to crack around the edges. Henry, you're not making sense. That money was in your savings account. Money that belongs to both of us as a married couple. Using marital assets isn't theft. You're absolutely right, I agreed. Using marital assets isn't theft, but that's not what you did. I pulled out another document from the folder, a bank statement that Margaret had never seen before. The account you accessed, the one you thought was my primary savings, was actually a business account. Specifically, it was an account I opened 6 months ago when I suspected you might be planning something like this. Margaret's wine glass stopped halfway to her lips. What are you talking about? The $400,000 you stole wasn't my money, Margaret. It was a business loan I took out in your name, using your Social Security number and the power of attorney documents we signed when we bought this house. I watched her face as the implications began to sink in. Technically, you just stole $400,000 from yourself. The wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the kitchen floor. Red wine spread across the white tiles like blood, staining everything it touched. That's impossible. I accessed your account. I used your passwords. You accessed an account that I wanted you to access. The passwords were changed 6 months ago to ones I knew you would eventually discover. The balance you saw was created specifically for you to steal. I pulled out the final document, the one I had been saving for this moment. My real assets, the accounts you never found, are completely untouched. Margaret stared at the bank statements, showing accounts with balances she had never seen before, investments she didn't know existed, assets that had been carefully protected while she planned her elaborate theft. The color drained from her face as she realized that while she thought she was destroying me, I had been orchestrating her destruction instead. You planned this, she whispered. For 6 months, I confirmed. Ever since I noticed you taking photos of important documents when you thought I wasn't looking. Ever since you started asking questions about my work schedule and travel plans. Ever since you became someone I didn't recognize. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You can't prove any of this. It's your word against mine. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Actually, Margaret, I can prove all of it. Because you documented every penny you spent, every meal you ate, every hotel you stayed in. You even sent me videos of yourself celebrating your victory over the husband you had outsmarted. The realization hit her like a physical blow. All those photos, all those mocking messages, all those videos she had sent to humiliate me were now evidence of a crime she had committed against herself. She had created a perfect paper trail of her own theft. The business loan you took out, I continued, came with personal liability clauses. That means you're legally responsible for every penny, plus interest, plus penalties for early withdrawal and misuse of funds. The $400,000 you spent in Europe is now a debt you owe to the bank, along with about $50,000 in additional fees and interest. Margaret slumped back into her chair, her designer clothes suddenly looking like a costume she could no longer afford to wear. Henry, please, we can work this out. I made a mistake, but we can fix this together. No, Margaret, we can't. I gathered the documents back into the folder, feeling lighter than I had in months. You see, there's one more thing you don't know about that business loan. She looked up at me with eyes that had lost all their earlier confidence. I never signed the final paperwork. Technically, the loan was never approved, which means the $400,000 you stole wasn't just borrowed money. It was money that was never legally disbursed in the first place. Margaret's face went completely white as she understood what that meant. She hadn't just stolen borrowed money. She had somehow managed to steal money that didn't exist, creating a financial and legal nightmare that would follow her for years to come. "Welcome home," I said quietly, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone with the wine stain and the wreckage of the plan that was supposed to destroy me. The first call came at 6:15 the next morning, while Margaret was still sleeping off what I assumed was a sleepless night of contemplating her situation. I heard her phone ring from the guest bedroom where she had relocated after our kitchen conversation, followed by her voice, initially groggy but quickly becoming sharp with panic. "What do you mean frozen, all of them?" I was making coffee in the kitchen, the same kitchen where wine stains still marked the white tiles despite her late-night cleaning attempts. Through the thin walls of our Westfield home, I could hear fragments of her conversation with what sounded like her bank. "But I have automatic payments scheduled. The credit cards, the car loan, the—" Her voice trailed off, and I knew she was beginning to understand the scope of her problem. By 7:30, she emerged from the guest room looking like someone who had aged 5 years overnight. Her expensive European tan seemed to have faded, replaced by a grayish pallor that no amount of designer cosmetics could hide. She found me reading the newspaper at the kitchen table, drinking my coffee from the same mug I had used every morning for the past decade. "They froze my accounts," she said without preamble. I looked up from the business section where an article about corporate fraud had caught my attention. "All of them. Every single one. Checking, savings, credit cards, even the joint account." She sat down across from me, her hands shaking slightly as she poured coffee from the pot I had left on the counter. "The bank representative said there's an investigation into suspicious financial activity." "That was fast," I observed. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "You reported it, didn't you?" "I didn't have to. Banks have automated systems that flag unusual transaction patterns. When someone suddenly moves $400,000 through multiple accounts in a single day, especially when those transactions originate from a loan account with irregularities, the system notices." I folded the newspaper and set it aside. The investigation would have started automatically. She stared into her coffee cup as if it might contain answers to problems she was only beginning to comprehend. "How long does an investigation like this usually take?" "Months, usually. Sometimes years if it's complicated." I stood up to refill my mug. "Of course, in cases where there's clear documentation of the crime, things move much faster." "Documentation?" I almost felt sorry for her. "Almost. Margaret, you sent me photographs and videos of yourself spending the money. You created a day-by-day record of every transaction, every purchase, every meal. You even included timestamps and location data." The coffee cup trembled in her hands. "Those were private messages between a husband and wife. Actually, they were evidence of a crime, and since you sent them to me voluntarily, there's no legal expectation of privacy." I sat back down, studying her face, as the full weight of her situation began to settle in. The prosecution will love those photos. Juries respond very strongly to defendants who document their own crimes. Margaret's phone rang again. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize, but the conversation that followed was clearly with another financial institution. Then another call, and another. By 9 o'clock, she had fielded 6 calls from banks, credit card companies, and what sounded like a law firm. "They want me to come in for questioning," she said after ending the latest call. "Who?" "Everyone, apparently. The bank's fraud department, the FBI Financial Crimes Unit, the district attorney's office." She looked at me with something approaching desperation. "Henry, I need a lawyer." "Yes, you do. A very good one, I imagine." She reached for her phone again, probably to start searching for legal representation, then stopped. "How am I supposed to pay for a lawyer when all my accounts are frozen?" It was a question I had been expecting. That's going to be challenging. Over the next 3 hours, I watched Margaret's world systematically collapse. Every phone call brought new problems, new complications she hadn't anticipated when she was planning her elaborate theft. The law firm that handled our mortgage called to inform her that the automatic payment for our house had been declined. The dealership where she leased her Mercedes left a voicemail about her missed payment. Even the country club we belonged to called to discuss her overdue membership fees. But the most devastating call came just after noon from a number with a European country code. "James?" Margaret answered, and I knew immediately she was talking to her traveling companion. I couldn't hear his side of the conversation, but from Margaret's responses it was clear that her partner in crime was distancing himself from the situation as quickly as possible. "But you said you loved me," she said, her voice cracking for the first time since her return. A long pause. "What do you mean you never promised anything?" Another pause, longer this time. "James, please, don't hang up. James!" She stared at her phone for several minutes after the call ended, as if willing it to ring again. When it became clear that James had no intention of calling back, she set the phone down and looked at me with eyes that had lost all their earlier defiance. "He's gone," she said simply. "I assume James was the man in the photographs?" She nodded, unable to meet my gaze. "We met 8 months ago. He said he was a consultant, that he traveled for work. He said he had been looking for someone like me his whole life." "Someone married to a man with $400,000 in savings?" Margaret flinched. "It wasn't like that at first. He didn't know about your money until I told him." "When did you tell him?" "After I found the account information on your phone. I was excited, thought we could start a real life together somewhere else. He suggested we take some of the money for a test run to see how it felt to be free." I leaned back in my chair, marveling at how completely she had been manipulated. "Margaret, a man you met 8 months ago convinced you to steal $400,000 from your husband of 22 years, and now you're surprised that he's disappeared the moment there are legal consequences." She started crying then, not the dramatic tears she had probably practiced for effect, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone who had finally realized the magnitude of her mistakes. "What am I going to do?" Before I could answer, there was a knock at our front door. Through the living room window, I could see 2 people in dark suits standing on our porch. They had the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement officers. "I think that question is about to be answered for you," I said, standing up to get the door. The FBI agents were polite but direct. They had a warrant for Margaret's arrest on charges of wire fraud, money laundering, and theft of funds exceeding $100,000. They also had a search warrant for our home, specifically looking for computers, phones, and financial documents related to the case. As they read Margaret her rights, she looked at me with a mixture of panic and something that might have been regret. "Henry, please don't let them do this." But there was nothing I could do, even if I had wanted to. Margaret had created this situation through months of careful planning and deliberate choices. The consequences she was now facing were the direct result of her own actions, documented in exhaustive detail through the photographs and videos she had sent me. As the agents escorted her to their car, Margaret turned back toward the house one more time. "This isn't over," she called out. I stood in the doorway, watching the car disappear down our quiet suburban street. She was right in a way. This wasn't over. The legal proceedings would take months, maybe years. There would be trials, appeals, depositions, and countless hours of testimony. Margaret's attorney, when she finally found one willing to work with her limited resources, would probably try to argue that I had entrapped her, that the phantom account was evidence of my own criminal intent. But I had been preparing for this possibility for 6 months. Every step I had taken had been carefully planned with legal counsel, every document had been reviewed, every action had been designed to withstand scrutiny. Margaret had played her game perfectly, but she had been playing by rules I had written specifically for her. As I walked back into the house, I noticed how quiet it seemed without her presence. 22 years of shared life, and it had taken less than 24 hours for our home to feel like mine alone. The wine stains on the kitchen floor caught my eye, and I realized I should probably clean them up properly. But first, I had a phone call to make. My attorney had been waiting for this development, and there were documents to file, procedures to follow. Margaret's arrest was just the beginning of a process that would officially end our marriage and legally protect the assets she had tried to steal. Outside, the autumn afternoon was crisp and clear, the kind of weather Margaret had always loved. But she wouldn't be enjoying many more afternoons like this one. Not for a very long time. The trial took place 9 months later in a federal courthouse in Newark that smelled of old wood and broken dreams. I sat in the gallery watching Margaret at the defendant's table in a public defender's suit that hung loose on her diminished frame. The woman who had once spent $15,000 on a necklace during a single afternoon in Paris now wore clothing provided by the court system. Her attorney, a young woman fresh out of law school with the overwhelmed expression of someone handling her first federal case, had tried various strategies during the pre-trial proceedings. She argued entrapment, claiming I had deliberately set up the phantom account to trick Margaret into committing a crime. She suggested duress, implying that our marriage had been so troubled that Margaret felt she had no choice but to steal from me. She even attempted to characterize the theft as a domestic dispute rather than a federal crime. None of it worked. The prosecution's case was devastatingly simple. They displayed Margaret's own photographs on large screens throughout the courtroom, showing her celebrating in expensive European restaurants while describing exactly how much of the stolen money she was spending. They played the video she had recorded on the balcony overlooking the Eiffel Tower, her voice echoing through the courtroom as she thanked her generous ex-husband for funding her freedom. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the prosecutor said during his opening statement, "this is not a case about a troubled marriage or a moment of poor judgment. This is a case about a defendant who spent months planning and executing the theft of $400,000, who documented her crime with photographs and videos, and who took such pleasure in her victim's presumed suffering that she sent him daily updates about how she was spending his money." Margaret's mother attended the first 3 days of the trial, sitting 2 rows behind me with the rigid posture of someone trying to maintain dignity in an impossible situation. But by the 4th day, her seat was empty. Margaret's sister, who had always been her closest confidant, stopped returning her calls after the arrest. Even the few friends who had initially offered support gradually disappeared as the details of the case became public. The most damaging testimony came from James Crawford, Margaret's traveling companion, who had been granted immunity in exchange for his cooperation. Under oath, he described how Margaret had recruited him into her scheme, how she had shown him screenshots of what she believed was my bank account balance, and how she had promised him a percentage of the stolen money if he would help her disappear afterward. "She told me her husband was a fool who deserved to lose everything," James testified, his voice carrying across the silent courtroom. "She said he was so focused on work that he would never notice what was happening until it was too late." When Margaret's attorney asked James about his relationship with her client, his answer was brutal in its honesty. "I told her what she wanted to hear. She was a middle-aged woman with access to a large amount of money and a husband she wanted to leave. It seemed like a mutually beneficial arrangement." "Did you love her?" James looked directly at Margaret for the first time during his testimony. "No. I saw an opportunity and I took it. Just like she did." Margaret's face crumpled as she heard the words that destroyed her final illusion. The man she had thrown away 22 years of marriage for, the man she had committed a federal crime to be with, had never seen her as anything more than a convenient source of funding for his lifestyle. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned with their verdict, Margaret stood between her attorney and the bailiff, her hands clasped in front of her like someone praying for a miracle that wasn't coming. The foreman, a middle-aged man who reminded me of my own father, read the verdict in a clear, steady voice that carried the weight of absolute certainty. Guilty on all counts. Margaret's knees buckled slightly and her attorney reached out to steady her. The judge scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, but everyone in the courtroom knew that Margaret was looking at significant prison time, federal wire fraud carrying a potential sentence of 20 years, and the amount involved meant she would likely receive something close to the maximum. As the bailiff led her away, Margaret turned to look at me one last time. There was no anger in her expression anymore, no defiance or calculation. Just a hollow emptiness that comes from finally understanding the full consequences of your choices. Outside the courthouse, Margaret's attorney approached me. She was young, probably not much older than 30, with the kind of earnest idealism that gets beaten out of public defenders within their first few years of practice. "Mr. Holloway," she said, "my client would like to speak with you about a possible plea agreement for the sentencing phase." "What kind of plea agreement?" "She's willing to provide full restitution of the stolen funds in exchange for a reduced sentence recommendation." I almost laughed. "Counselor, your client spent $400,000 in Europe and has had all her assets frozen. What exactly is she planning to use for restitution?" The young attorney's confidence wavered. "She was hoping that perhaps you might be willing to help her, given your long marriage." "Help her pay back the money she stole from me?" "The money was never actually yours," she said, grasping for any legal foothold. "The account she accessed was funded by a business loan that was never properly executed." "That's correct," I agreed. "Which means your client managed to steal money that didn't exist, creating a debt that she now owes to the bank regardless of my involvement. Even if I wanted to help her, which I don't, paying her restitution wouldn't reduce her legal obligations." The attorney's shoulders sagged as she realized that Margaret's situation was even worse than she had initially understood. Not only was Margaret facing federal prison time, but she would emerge from that prison carrying a debt that would follow her for the rest of her life. 6 weeks later, I returned to the same courthouse for Margaret's sentencing. This time, I was the only familiar face in the gallery. Even Margaret's mother, who had maintained minimal contact through the trial, was nowhere to be seen. Margaret had lost considerable weight during her time in federal detention. Her once carefully maintained appearance had been replaced by the generic look of someone whose life was now controlled entirely by institutional schedules. When she stood to hear her sentence, she seemed smaller somehow, diminished in a way that went beyond physical appearance. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, with silver hair and no patience for federal criminals, reviewed the case file before speaking. "Mrs. Holloway, you have been convicted of crimes that show a shocking level of premeditation and callousness. You didn't simply steal money from your husband. You planned this theft for months, executed it with sophistication, and then took pleasure in documenting your victim's presumed suffering." Margaret stood silent as the judge continued. "The photographs and videos you sent to your husband show someone who was not acting out of desperation or momentary poor judgment, but someone who was savoring the destruction you believed you were causing. This court has rarely seen such clear evidence of a defendant's satisfaction in their victim's pain." The sentence was 15 years in federal prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years contingent on full restitution of the stolen funds plus interest and penalties. Given that Margaret would emerge from prison with no assets and a debt of over $600,000, parole seemed unlikely. As the bailiff led her away for the final time, Margaret didn't look back. Perhaps she had finally learned that looking backward only showed her the wreckage of choices she could never undo. I walked out of the courthouse into a bright spring afternoon, feeling something I hadn't experienced in over a year: complete freedom. The legal proceedings were over. The divorce had been finalized months earlier, and Margaret was no longer my problem to solve or my burden to carry. My phone buzzed with a text message from my attorney. "It's finished. Congratulations on your new life." I looked at those words for a long moment, then deleted the message and walked toward my car. Margaret had spent months planning what she thought would be my destruction, but in the end she had simply cleared the path for me to discover who I really was when I wasn't trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. The drive back to Westfield would take about an hour, through suburbs that looked different now that I saw them as a single man rather than as half of a failed marriage. I had decisions to make about the house, about my work, about the kind of future I wanted to build with the assets Margaret had failed to steal. But those decisions could wait. For now it was enough to drive through the afternoon sunlight, knowing that the woman who had tried to destroy me was finally facing the consequences of her own choices, and that I was finally free to make choices of my own. 2 years after Margaret's sentencing, I stood in the kitchen of my new apartment in Manhattan, making coffee in a machine that cost more than Margaret's entire prison commissary account for a month. The irony wasn't lost on me. While she was learning to appreciate instant coffee from a vending machine, I was finally living the life I'd been building for 22 years but never allowed myself to enjoy. The apartment overlooked Central Park from the 32nd floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that filled every room with natural light. Margaret had always preferred heavy curtains and dim lighting, claiming bright spaces gave her headaches. Now I understood that she simply preferred the shadows where her deceptions could flourish undetected. I had sold the house in Westfield 6 months after her conviction, not because I needed the money, but because I couldn't stand to live in a place where every room contained memories of a marriage that had been a lie. The new owners were a young couple with twins, and they had been delighted by the spacious kitchen where Margaret had once planned my financial destruction. My work life had undergone its own transformation. Without the constant undercurrent of domestic deception, I found I could concentrate in ways I hadn't in years. The company promoted me to senior partner 8 months after Margaret's arrest, recognizing work performance that had apparently been constrained by the stress I hadn't even realized I was carrying. "You seem lighter somehow," my colleague David had observed during a lunch meeting where we discussed my expanded role. "More focused." "Divorce will do that," I had replied, not bothering to explain that my marriage had ended not with arguments or counseling sessions, but with federal marshals and felony convictions. The financial aspects of my new life were equally liberating. Without Margaret's expensive tastes and secret planning, my actual income allowed for luxuries I had forgotten I enjoyed. I bought season tickets to the Metropolitan Opera, something Margaret had always dismissed as pretentious. I hired a personal trainer and rediscovered the physical fitness I had neglected during years of working excessive hours to fund a lifestyle that was never really mine. Most surprisingly, I found myself socializing again. Margaret had gradually isolated us from friends and family over the years, always finding reasons why dinner parties were inconvenient or why couples' vacations were too expensive. Now I realized she had been protecting her double life by minimizing our contact with people who might have noticed inconsistencies in her stories. I joined a hiking club that met every Saturday morning in the Hudson Valley. The group consisted mostly of professionals in their 40s and 50s who shared my appreciation for outdoor exercise and intelligent conversation without the performance anxiety that had characterized most of Margaret's social preferences. It was during one of these Saturday hikes that I met Sarah, a divorced architect with 2 teenage children, and a laugh that reminded me what genuine joy sounded like. She had been married to a man who turned out to have been living multiple secret lives, including several ongoing affairs and a gambling addiction that had consumed their children's college funds. The betrayal wasn't even the worst part, she told me during a rest stop overlooking the Hudson River. It was realizing that I had been making excuses for behavior I knew was wrong, just because I wanted to believe I could save someone who didn't want to be saved. Her words resonated with an accuracy that surprised me. I had spent years adjusting my own expectations downward, accepting Margaret's distance and criticism as normal rather than acknowledging that I was living with someone who fundamentally didn't respect me. Sarah and I began having coffee after our weekend hikes, then occasional dinners during the week. Our relationship developed with the careful deliberation of 2 people who had learned to recognize red flags and trust their instincts. Neither of us was rushing toward commitment, but both of us appreciated the luxury of honest communication after years of navigating conversational minefields. "What happened to your ex-wife?" Sarah asked one evening as we shared dessert at a small restaurant near her office. I had been expecting this question for weeks, and I had decided to answer it honestly. "She's serving 15 years in federal prison for stealing $400,000 from a bank account she thought belonged to me." Sarah's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. "She thought belonged to you." "It's a long story." "I have time." So I told her everything. The surveillance software, the months of planning, the European vacation funded by stolen money, the photographs Margaret had sent to document my presumed destruction. I explained about the phantom account, the business loan that was never properly executed, and the legal trap that Margaret had walked into with such precise documentation of her own crimes. When I finished, Sarah was quiet for several minutes. Then she began laughing, not with malicious satisfaction, but with the amazement of someone who recognized perfect justice when she heard it. She documented her own crime because she wanted you to suffer? Every purchase, every meal, every moment of what she thought was her victory over me. Sarah shook her head in wonder. It's like she wrote her own confession and mailed it to the prosecutor. Essentially, yes. Do you ever hear from her? She writes occasionally. Letters asking for money for commissary items, for help with legal appeals, for assistance contacting lawyers who might work for free. I had brought one of Margaret's letters with me. Not sure why, but feeling like Sarah should understand the complete picture. Would you like to see the most recent one? Sarah nodded, and I handed her the envelope I had received the previous week. Margaret's handwriting had changed during her imprisonment, becoming smaller and more cramped, as if she were trying to conserve space on the limited paper available to federal inmates. Dear Henry, Sarah read aloud, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to understand that I never meant for things to go this far. I was confused and scared, and I made terrible decisions that hurt both of us. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, and I realize now that I threw away the best thing in my life for a fantasy that was never real. If you could find it in your heart to help me with a lawyer for my appeal, I would be forever grateful. I still love you, and I hope someday you can forgive me. Love, Margaret. Sarah folded the letter and handed it back to me. Are you going to help her? No. Why not? I considered the question carefully because it was one I had asked myself repeatedly over the past 2 years. Because helping her would require me to pretend that what she did was impulsive rather than calculated, desperate rather than greedy. Margaret didn't make a mistake, Sarah. She made hundreds of deliberate choices over many months, and she enjoyed every moment of what she thought was my destruction. Sarah nodded slowly. And because helping her would mean going back to being the person who enables someone else's bad decisions, instead of protecting yourself. Exactly. We finished dinner and walked through the city streets as autumn settled over Manhattan with the kind of crisp clarity that makes everything seem possible. Sarah linked her arm through mine, a gesture of companionship rather than possession, and I realized how different it felt to be with someone who wanted my company, rather than my resources. Do you think she'll ever understand what she really lost? Sarah asked as we reached the corner where we would part ways to our respective apartments. I don't think Margaret is capable of understanding what she lost because she never valued it in the first place. I paused, considering my own words. But I understand what I gained when she tried to destroy me. What's that? The knowledge that I'm strong enough to protect myself from people who don't have my best interests at heart, even when those people have shared my bed for 22 years. Sarah kissed me goodnight, a gentle kiss that carried affection but no manipulation, no calculation about what it might lead to or what it might cost me. As I walked the remaining blocks to my apartment, I thought about Margaret sitting in her federal prison cell, probably writing another letter asking for help from the husband she had tried to financially destroy. She would be eligible for parole in 8 more years, but only if she could provide full restitution of the money she had stolen. Given that she would emerge from prison with no assets, no marketable skills, and a federal felony record, the likelihood of her raising $600,000 seemed remote. I reached my building and took the elevator to the 32nd floor, where my apartment waited with its wall of windows overlooking the city that had become my new home. Tomorrow was Saturday, which meant another hike with the group, another opportunity to spend time with people who chose to be in my life rather than people who were trapped there by circumstance or obligation. Margaret had spent months planning what she thought would be my destruction, but in the end she had simply freed me from a life that was slowly suffocating me. Her betrayal had been the catalyst that forced me to examine what I really wanted from my remaining years, and what I discovered was that I wanted honesty, authenticity, and the company of people who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could provide. As I made my evening coffee and settled into the reading chair by the window, I reflected on the strange justice of my situation. Margaret was serving 15 years for stealing money that had never belonged to me, while I was finally living a life that was entirely my own. She had gambled everything on a scheme to take what she thought was mine, and in losing that gamble she had given me the greatest gift imaginable, complete freedom from her presence in my life. The city sparkled below my windows, full of possibilities I was finally free to explore, and somewhere in a federal prison, Margaret was probably still trying to figure out how her perfect plan had gone so wrong. Some lessons, I realized, can only be learned the hard way, and some people never learn them at all.